Stepping from homelessness to housing to home. Um, and on the theme of pointing our feet towards right relationship. This afternoon, I'm going to walk us through a bit of a discussion about the housing crisis. We're going to touch on some points. It's a pretty broad topic, but we'll touch on it. Um, and ask the question, when we talk about housing, is housing enough to address the issues that we're talking about, that we're referencing? Um, and I'm going to propose four uh, P words that we might think about as we engage on issues of social justice, but in particular on this issue of housing. So those are people, place people, persistence, and purpose. One of the things I found and one of the things I've observed as I've uh, begun to dip my toes into these sorts of issues, and I'm by no means an expert. I don't have a lived experience of homelessness myself, and so I rely on other experts in our community for the best knowledge that I've got. But in and amidst all this, there can be a sense of hopelessness, or it can be hard to hang on to hope. And so, as I was thinking about this theme of stepping somewhere or pointing our feet somewhere towards right relationship, I was reminded of a photo I took a few years ago when I was visiting the Art Gallery of Ontario. So in Grange Park to the south of that, there's a variety of quotes that are engraved on the sidewalk. And this one from Gwendolyn McEwen jumped out at me. Look, in shattered midnights, on black ice under silver trees, we are still dancing, dancing. And I think that sort of perspective, one that gives hope in spite of the darkness, in spite of the midnights, in spite of what's shattered, is important to keep in mind. And I'm also reminded of from John's Gospel that my Father's house has many rooms, your Father's house has many rooms, our God's house has many rooms. And so we take hope in that there is a place for each of us in God's kingdom. There's been some land acknowledgements that have been delivered today, and I just wanted to add a bit of a personal take on that. I am coming to you today from Port Hope, which is near the shore of Lake Ontario and also the shores of the Ganaraska River. And so, reflecting on that, the fish, or the Jesus fish, or the ichthys, is an important Christian symbol. It's also a reminder for me here in this place of the river, of the land, of people who have come before me here in this place. The Ganaraska River at one point in time was a very abundant river, and a nearby Cayuga village is the earliest recorded human dwelling in this area that we now call Port Hope. And so for me, this place now is a place where I've journeyed in my faith so far. And so for the fish has a number of symbolic references for me. But ultimately, I think it's a reminder that we're called to love one another in our diversity and share in the abundance of God's creation. So it's with that spirit that I share what I have to share with you this afternoon. So I want to start with a question for you, which you can put in the chat perhaps, and the moderators can help with that, or feel free to unmute. Just looking for a few people maybe to respond with. When you think of home, how would you describe it? What is it that that evokes home for you? Okay, so I can see the chat, which is a good thing. Safety and security, where we feel comfortable, warm, safe, uh, a place with my family, a warm place that is my own. Thanks for those responses. When we talk about the issue of homelessness and housing and trying to move towards home, I think it's important to keep in mind the word home contained within homelessness, and think about these things that have been mentioned in the chat uh, as we talk about this issue. Those sorts of things that people are mentioning are really, I think, what we're driving for as solutions when we are trying to engage on the issue of housing and homelessness. So let's keep those ideas in mind. Okay, now I have another question for you, which is, how is the housing crisis being experienced in your community? Perhaps you've made some personal observations about the housing crisis recently, or in recent months or years. Is there a reaction that your community is having? Maybe there's a variety of reactions or responses that are happening in your community. Are there concerns that are being raised or questions that are being raised? How are you seeing the housing crisis where you are? Feel free to unmute if you'd like to use your voice instead of your keyboard.
Okay, it's Peter Newell. I at All Saints at the corner of Sherburne and Dundas in Toronto, and one of the things that we encounter a lot, because a lot of our folks are really right out there. I mean, we have a fair number of people that are just on the street, and that's actually where they are, except when it's really coming down heavy with rain or something like that, and then we have the sort of adjoining sort of residential streets like Seton Street and that just come nearby us, and so that there is, and a lot of the folks that are living there are people who did they're sort of, it's a move towards gentrification, and so that there are people who made an investment at some point, hoping, figuring that things might gentrify a bit, and also thinking that, darn it, they paid for their place, and they're people should be more respectful. And the folks that actually come to our drop-in aren't always all that respectful. And so that creates tensions with the local BIA and that sort of thing. So we actually, that's, in terms of neighborhood, that's the, if you want to create, talk about the sort of possibility of a dissonance, that's sort of how it is. There's another thing, but I've done talking. I can't keep talking forever, but the other thing, of course, is within the actual community of homeless people, there is an authentic sense of community, a kind of a wacky sense, but there is a sense of community that's quite strong. But I'll let somebody else talk.
Okay. Thanks, Peter. And I got a message from somebody that you were seeing my other screen, the split screen. So are you seeing sort of just the slides now?
Yeah.
Okay, that's better for you. Yeah. Um, Thanks, Peter. And I'm seeing in the comments here, you know, uh, concerns from some people, ignorance on the parts of others, that essentially the issue is becoming more visible because people who are experiencing homeless seem to be perhaps more visible than they used to be in our communities.
And we have Stuart, Danielle, and Louise with raised hands.
Hi, Stu. How are you seeing this in your community?
Well, I'm from a completely opposite All Saints in Whitby. I'm guessing that I am a little bit removed from the streets, and so I'm not aware of any. I'm sure we have homeless in Whitby, but I'm not aware of any of them. I'm aware that there's a lot of new construction going up, but it is shifted from single family dwellings to it looks to me like townhomes, much to the north of the town, but there seems to be a lot of building and going on. I moved, I think several years ago, from a 5-bedroom house with a swimming pool and everything to an apartment, and so I'm far from homeless, but I'm very much downsized, and we're quite comfortable where we are. I only recently found out, however, the building that we're in, I think under the sponsorship of a local politician, was some kind of a deal was made between the township, the town, the provincial government, and the federal government to fund this building, which is owned by a corporation, but has quite low rents with very limited rent increases. So we're quite comfortable here. And so the only awareness I have, not so much of homelessness, but our food bank at our church, which is called the Deacon's Cupboard, is quite a busy place. So we're aware that there are people who are down on their luck, and we're happy to support that effort.
Thanks, Stu. I'm going to take Danielle and then Louise for your quick remarks, and then there'll be time at the end for some more conversation and questions. So, Danielle?
Yeah, there were two kind of points that I have noticed. I am in Thornhill. A couple of, I would say pre-COVID, our church was, well, they did actually host an Out of the Cold through Mosaic Interfaith, which is the sort of Thornhill, Richmond Hill interfaith program for homelessness overnight housing. But there was a lot of split in the church over whether we should actually host an evening of this. I will say that we did do it. Some people who were on the anti side did come round to the pro side and acknowledge that their impressions of what it would have been or who these people were had been incorrect. And so I think that kind of trying to get rid of that sort of perspective in order to help people is part of the issue. And the other thing I'll say, I'm a psychotherapist in private practice. And while most of my clients have insurance and can afford me, I am having people at particularly sort of late 20s, early 30s, who are living with family in sort of dysfunctional situations, but due to high rents and excessive student debt, there isn't a way to get out of that immediately, and it's affecting mental health. So,
Thank you. Yeah, very good comment. And I'd like to come back and talk about a couple of things you mentioned there. Louise, and then
I'll keep it brief. I'm here in Wasaga Beach, and I've been here since June. And interesting in this community, I'm the deacon in charge of the church here. And interesting in this community, if you were asked to ask someone, they would say there's nobody homeless. But we know we serve about 1,000 people a month at the food bank. Population of Wasaga Beach is 22,000, so that puts that in context. And in the summer, people camp, and in the winter, they couch surf. So really, other than the camping, which is very hidden, the homelessness is quite invisible. And so people don't really realize that there are, but we certainly have seen at the food bank. And we don't have any kind of shelter of any kind here. So the OPP, they have a great mental health response team, and they will drive people to the shelter in Barrie or Collingwood. But then in the morning, they're kicked out, and then they're in the wrong community. So that's one of the challenges that we have.
Yeah, thank you very much. So we're talking about a crisis here, and I think one of the observations that I make usually when I ask people the questions that I've asked you all today is that when people talk about what home is, they talk a lot about things that are related to relationship and where you feel safe and where you feel secure, and perhaps where you are known. And oftentimes when I ask people about, well, how are you seeing homelessness in your community? The conversation is more about sort of the physical nature of things. So where people are, or where people are being taken, or sometimes debates about what's the right way to address the issue. And sometimes this idea of what it is that actually makes home can be a little bit watered down or even completely lost. That's a theme we're going to continue to pick away at for the rest of our time together today. But I really want to focus on the idea of those things that are important to us as home. They have to be, I think, part of the solution when we're working on this issue. And then also, I think that I've certainly seen how tensions can arise between people, perhaps people who are well informed and want to see action very quickly on this front, and confronting other groups of people who are more hesitant or not as well informed. And I think also, as I watch those tensions play out, I think it's important to keep in mind that we're all members of the same community, and just like we're all in various places on our faith journey, we're all in our own journeys of sort of understanding the issues of the community around us. And so, I would implore us to all be generous and graceful when we're working in that space, and trying to educate people and trying to make progress together as a community. But one might ask the question, if you believe that the housing issues that our communities are facing now are a crisis, then I would invite you into the metaphor of a fire department. A fire department really has two missions. One is to respond to emergencies. So when there's a fire, we, I hope, have trust that we can pick up the telephone, excuse me, pick up the telephone, call 911, and somebody's going to come and respond and put out the fire. And my concern as a citizen in my community is that I'm afraid that there are too many people in our community who feel like if they pick up the telephone, nobody's coming. And that's something that I think many of us would not find acceptable. And so that response to a crisis, and how we respond to a crisis, and do we have a sense of urgency about it, is something for us all to think about as we engage with our friends and neighbors and other agencies and levels of government who have a part to play. The other issue, of course, is, or the other mission that a fire department has, is prevention. And this is the idea of, well, let's not just pull people out of the river after they've fallen in, but let's prevent people from falling into the river in the first place. Let's stop the fires before they happen. And this is also a very important part of the response to housing issues. So nothing that I'm going to be telling you today am I ignoring the importance of prevention and many things that need to be done in order to make some pretty, I'd say, dramatic changes to housing issues here in Ontario. But emergency response is important. The kind of rhetorical question that I want to ask is, what's the reality right now? I think it was Louise, you mentioned that these issues can be invisible, and Stu, you said that, in your day-to-day goings about, you're not really confronted with this. And I think the reality is that, if in that image on the right, that matchstick that's caught on fire sort of represents what many of us see when it comes to homelessness. We're seeing the tip of something which could be much bigger. And what we're not seeing catch on fire necessarily are people who are able to sort of stay out of sight, and people would have very good reasons for wanting to stay out of sight. People who are couch surfing or perhaps sleeping in their cars may not be as visible as somebody who's sheltering in a tent. But also more and more, I'm hearing concerns about senior citizens and risks regarding the ability to afford housing in the future. And so when we see signs that there's a crisis in our communities, I think it's important that we take notice of that, because it's sort of like the tip of the iceberg. There's many more matches which I think are at risk of catching on fire than what we see. Here in my community in Northumberland County, we probably have about 130 people or so would be a safe guesstimate. We've got 80 people on a named list who are experiencing homelessness, and a bunch more who aren't on the named list but who are known. We've got a vacancy rate that is less than 0.8%. And, March of this year, the average house was selling for $1 million. So you needed to be earning $150,000 a year in order to be able to afford that average sort of home in Northumberland County. And we also have a recognized gap between, what you need to afford, or what you need to make to afford the average rent, which is about $1,500 a month if you can find a place, and what you're making if you're earning minimum wage. So there's about a $10 gap there between minimum wage and what you need to be earning in order to really to be able to afford a typical rent here. So if anybody's not certain about whether there's a crisis, I can tell you there certainly is one here. We've got about 34 shelter spaces available in the county, and that's not nearly enough to respond to over 100 people who are facing these issues, and potentially more who are a little more out of sight. So I want to talk a bit about Greenwood Coalition. Yes, we go from red to green. I'm on the board of directors at Greenwood Coalition, and Greenwood defies definition, I think, or at least we try to a certain extent. But what I want to tell you about Greenwood, because it's going to come up later, a little bit more about Greenwood, is that this is an organization that really takes a radically inclusive approach to walking alongside people, and really those people in our community who are hurting the most. So Greenwood does outreach work to people in our community, and we advocate. Our executive director is there, featured in the newspaper article, sort of concerned about government response to the issue. But we also do fun stuff, and we also try to activate the community, and that's sort of represented by the photos on the lower right, where we're giving away free hot dogs in the summer. Who doesn't like a hot dog? And so we're trying to engage with the community and really help the community understand its strengths. And as I heard David say one time, we look like who showed up. So the people who are showing up to Greenwood Coalition events and supporting Greenwood Coalition are those people in our community who care, sometimes don't quite know what to do about it, but they showed up. And I think one of the things we try to demonstrate at Greenwood is that showing up and just engaging is a first step. Greenwood gets its name because the ministry that Greenwood carries out, the service that Greenwood carries out in the community, the engagement that it has with the community started here at this place known as Greenwood Towers. Now, back in the day, before I came to Port Hope, this would have been the hot spot to have your wedding or your big birthday celebration. In more recent times, though, as this quote from a resident in the motel at the tower said, it's a place to go when you've lost respect for yourself. And so there was Deacon Barb Russell, who first got me engaged with this community. There was a weekly dinner that was being hosted for the residents at the motel. I think there was about 25 people at the time, and we were hosting dinners in rough conditions. There was no heat or running water in the main building, and out of that, though, has grown something. Out of that grew this organization we now know as Greenwood Coalition, which has spread into many more sorts of engagement with the community. But this place where this ministry started has also evolved. And so today, there's sort of an image of a fellow I was speaking with at the tower a few weeks ago. He would call this home. And this has become a place where people can help support one another. It certainly can be a place of chaos, perhaps at times, but it represents the sort of change that can happen when you start with building community, like around those dinners that started to be hosted here in this place many years ago. So, homelessness. I've shared a little bit of information about the Northumberland context for you already. If you're not aware of the situation in your own community, I would encourage you to educate yourself. It's not too hard to find some information that government agencies will provide. Your community probably has some sort of housing strategy or affordable housing strategy. It might even have a homelessness response plan. Those are okay places to start. But also it's important to engage with the experts who have lived experience, as well as people who are walking alongside those who are experts in homelessness. It's really, really important that as we think about how we might respond to housing issues, that we're involving directly those people in your communities who are facing those challenges. And so in the approaches that we're taking in our community, I've come to a better understanding. I used to think I was empathetic towards this issue, but I realize now that I really wasn't until I started to engage with people who've really got experience in this. So in anything that you're doing in your own places, I really encourage you to find the ways to engage with those people who are living it, and might start with those organizations in your community who are serving or ministering to people who are struggling with these challenges. there is this idea that there is never room at the inn. And you can get into conversations or read information from shelters that might lead you to believe that there's space available. And technically, that might be correct sometimes, but it often doesn't paint the entire picture. Some shelter spaces, for example, might be reserved for women only or families only, and every other spot might be filled up, and there might be a list of or a group of people who are waiting to get in. But in those situations, a shelter still might report that they're not at full capacity. And that's where expert information can sort of help. So there's the issue of, is there room at the inn, and what's the reality there? But there's also this idea of the feeling of homelessness. I was speaking with a couple of people who said that basically you get so beaten down and so discouraged and so used to being turned away that this idea of homelessness is something that starts to inhabit you, that even if you have a place to go, that is not all the healing that's necessary to eradicate the problem of homelessness. There's this feeling that that there's no room for you because so many people have told you that there is no room for you. And I think correcting that does not happen quickly. And so that's where the solutions need to move beyond just providing a structure for people to sleep in, but true healing. A couple of pictures here are from a little, I guess, demonstration that we had at Christmas last year at our church. We set up a tent to gather some useful supplies for people who may be sleeping rough in our community. And the idea here is that for some people, whether it's the way they feel or whether it's their physical reality, there's never room at the inn. That's the way it seems. And we want to change that. So the 4 Ps, place, people, persistence, and purpose. I met with Michelle and Blair, who I know from the Greenwood community. Blair was an outreach worker with Greenwood Coalition. Just recently, he's moved on to some other things. And Michelle is also a resident in the community. Blair and Michelle both live in the community. And I was speaking with them about their lived experiences and the challenges that they've had in their life, which have included homelessness and other issues. And in our conversation, we really settled on these 4 words as sort of being core to getting from homelessness to finding home. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about these. But this conversation, I really have to give credit to Blair and Michelle, who are my experts on this topic, and thank them for their insight and for their generosity in sharing. I think these things really make sense. So first of all, place. You may hear about housing first initiatives. It's not too hard to understand that if you don't have a place to go, if you're not sure where you're going to sleep every evening, if you don't have a place that you can trust that your belongings are going to be safe and secure, it's really hard to engage with other aspects of your life and to really grow as a human being. So a housing first principle makes sense, and that's really about place. Providing stability and security of person and their essential belongings is really foundational to being able to engage on the greater healing that may need to happen. And I think place also represents the beginning of neighborhood. It's hard to have a neighborhood if you don't have a geography in which to gather. We've been doing a lot on Zoom and virtual stuff, but you all know that's tough. that actually having a neighborhood and a physical community, a place where people are gathering and have shared interests is really important. And so that begins with place. So in moving beyond to other sorts of healing and wholeness and addressing this feeling of homelessness has got to start with some sort of place. And that's clearly lacking for many people. But also, as I've been touching on, and as you have pointed out, there is the importance of relationship and people in feeling at home. That home is a place where you just belong. And home is a place where, was it in the old TV show Cheers? Everybody knows your name. That you're an individual person. You're not a homeless person. You're not a tent person. You're Dave, or you're Blair, or you're Michelle. I was reminded about the parable of the prodigal son when I was reflecting on this. And I picked this verse out of Luke's gospel. But while he was still a long way off, that's the son, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. Now, isn't that a welcome home? Father didn't know anything that the son was going to ask at that moment. He saw him and he was filled with compassion and ran to his son. That's being at home, I think. And that's the sort of feeling that I would pray and wish for everybody in our community. Michelle said to me in my conversation with her that you'll always remember the people that didn't give up on you. And in this story of the prodigal son, the father never gave up. And in Michelle's personal journey, she expressed to me how important it was for a long time for just to have somebody that wasn't giving up on you, although it didn't seem that success was on the horizon, that they were not giving up, that they were relentless in having the courage to walk alongside her on her journey. And so that's where persistence comes in. Blair said a similar thing when I was chatting with him. When you come across someone who doesn't want to give up on you, he said, that's pretty cool. It's not a common thing. And for those people who may engage with people who are struggling with challenges, who are marginalized, I think this just speaks that it's really important just to be a presence sometimes, that even though it seems like there's not much you can do, being alongside somebody is really valuable. And Blair said something else about social justice that I thought was just spot on. He said social justice is not a fight. It's opening people's eyes. And I touched on this earlier, in this tension that we sometimes feel in our communities. It's important to remember that we're all members of the same community. And so let's not start a fight where one's not necessary, but let's help one another open our eyes to the issues that are around us, whether we bump into them or not on our day-to-day travels. I've got a little bit of a saying that I'm using with a sleeping cabin initiative that is just sort of emerging in our community here in Port Hope and Coburg, which is run until tackled. The idea there is we're going to press ahead until somebody tackles us. And every once in a while we'll have a little bit of a setback, or we'll get a no, and I'll say, that wasn't a tackle. That was just a block. We're still running. And last week I was speaking with a church in our community, and they had this scripture reading in their service from Hebrews, And let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. I think that's what is sort of summed up for me in the idea of run until tackled. That as Christians, we've got our eyes focused on Jesus, and hopefully we see Jesus in those people who we meet in our communities, and that we run to them, like the father in the prodigal son parable. And purpose. We started with the question about what feels like home, what's home, and you talked a lot about feelings. So when we engage on the issue of trying to address the housing crisis or trying to tackle homelessness, I think it's really important to remember that what we're driving to is those things that you spoke about. The purpose really isn't housing. That's a component of it. The purpose is home, which is much deeper and broader, and I think really important. To have a sense of purpose is invaluable, and when you're part of a community, you get that. I was listening to a podcast from a deacon in Peterborough, Christian Harvey. He works at One City Peterborough, and they were reflecting on the mayoral debate before the election in Peterborough. And in the podcast, he told a story about somebody who was living in Tent City in Peterborough, a tent community. And Christian asked this person, what is it that he likes about being here? Because he seemed to like being there. And essentially the response was that, here I have a purpose. When I'm out looking for an apartment, it's just constant rejection. So community and sense of purpose within that cannot be underestimated. And I think we're not providing the full solution if all we're doing is providing a structure for people to live in. I'd like to talk a little bit about, and I know some of you are interested to hear more about initiatives that are happening here in Northumberland County, where I am. And so there's a couple of things one thing that I've been involved with for a little while, and one thing that I've been involved with much more recently, which is sort of connected. And so I'm going to start talking about this initiative called Think Tiny Homes Northumberland. And this is a chapter of Habitat for Humanity Northumberland. The idea for this started with a conversation around Greenwood. So this is an example of where some people who were sort of connected with the Greenwood Coalition community were just sort of doing stuff that citizens do about talking about how things can be better. And eventually that turned into this organization, which is now formally connected to Habitat here in our community. So the goal of Think Tiny Homes is to create permanent tiny homes or micro communities. There's lots of different words that are used, but really small format housing that is more accessible to people who are in an underserved demographic here in our community. So if you are single, that is one area that is in particular underserviced by affordable housing. So this isn't the only solution, but it's part of the solution. But it's not just about providing structures. It's not just about providing the housing. It's about building community. These are not tiny homes that are going to be here or there scattered around, but a village of tiny homes where people can have the opportunity to become a neighborhood and support one another. The picture in the top right are some of the very early members, which were sort of engaged citizens, some members of council, and many of those people have moved on to other things, but we continue to work with Habitat on a search for an appropriate property to begin this initiative. And if I'm describing it to people, one of the really good examples that I can point to is what the Homes for Heroes Foundation has done in Calgary and Edmonton and is now beginning to do in Kingston. This is sort of a micro village of tiny homes. They're not all standalone. Some of them are connected together for energy efficiency reasons and things like that. But this Homes for Heroes Foundation, these veteran villages that have popped up in those 3 communities I mentioned, are places where specifically veterans who are in need of support and healing can go for a time in order to find that healing, seek that community, and then move on to something better when they're ready. I've been sort of interested to observe that there's been a lot of people ready to welcome the heroes into their communities, to welcome the veterans. It's a pretty good case when you've got a veteran who is hurting, that you want the community to rally around that. And so they've been able to get some pretty good success in getting communities started. I don't think we have the same feeling about those in our community who are facing other issues, mental health issues that are perhaps driven by addictions, other forms of trauma that that people are facing, and they end up being stigmatized. And there's not maybe quite as many people who are ready to welcome those people into their community like we do our veterans. And so I'm thankful that we do welcome our veterans, but let's also not leave anybody behind. You know, our community here in Port Hope welcomed 30 Ukrainian families this year, and those families were all housed within the community very rapidly. There was a lot of support for them. And so I say that not to disparage those efforts, but to say that I know the capacity is in our communities to support those who have needs. And I think that when we look to those in our community who are sleeping rough or facing issues of homelessness, that when we look them in the face and begin to engage with them and start to build trust and relationship, that some of those biases may fade away. An initiative I didn't know I was going to be engaged in when I agreed to deliver the talk today is this something we call the Northumberland Sleeping Cabin Collective. And it is not meant to be a permanent solution to housing issues. It's meant to be something that can be rapidly deployed and is intended to be temporary, to respond to people who are who don't have a place to go. The Sleeping Cabin Initiative is something that has started in other communities in Ontario, Kitchener-Waterloo, for example. Kingston and Peterborough is also pursuing a sleeping cabin initiative. So here in this photo, the photo closest to me, you'll see one of my comrades on this initiative, Jenny, along with her dad, and they are flanking Nadine, who is the inspiration behind the Sleeping Cabin Initiative in Kitchener and Waterloo. And oftentimes that's what these things need, is somebody who's willing to put the energy and sort of be the driving force and drag a few other people along. And I've become one of those people who've engaged with Jenny on this issue. And over the past 6 weeks, we've been knocking on a lot of doors and trying to make progress. We've borrowed a tiny sleeping cabin from Kingston. You can see the pastor from Grace Church here in Port Hope with one of our other team members, Megan, standing in front of the cabin, the pastor from one of the local Baptist church sitting in the doorway of the cabin there. We're really working on trying to engage with people, help them engage on the issue in our community, and sort of start from community. This is a community-driven initiative, and is an opportunity to help educate people about the issues and provide a really solid way for people to perhaps be able to do something about it. So we're hopeful that there will be progress here in our area on this sort of initiative soon. These photos here are from the community in Kingston in the top, or sorry, Kitchener in the top left. The middle photo at the top is a model cabin that Peterborough is working on, and in the lower left are cabins that are in Kingston. And the lower right photo is from the demonstration model in Peterborough. The idea of the sleeping cabins is that you provide people with a safe and secure place that they can actually call their own. They've got a key to the door that they can lock. That's their key that nobody else has. And you can rapidly deploy these because you do not need a building permit. They're less than 100 square feet. They don't have washroom facilities, so separate washroom facilities are provided for the community, same with kitchen facilities. But this is partly about creating the housing first, that first foothold on some stability and security that can lead to someplace else, and you're building community. The idea here is that there is a significant amount of self-governance that happens in the community around the sleeping cabin initiative. This is not something we're doing to people. This is something that people who live here can support one another and help govern their own neighborhood. So we're getting near the end here. I want to talk a little bit more about Greenwood. So I'm engaged with Think Tiny Homes and the Sleeping Cabin Initiative, and I'm a member of the board at Greenwood. And I'd spoken earlier that one of the things we try to do is activate the community around us to help the community unleash its potential. And there's a really good book by a fellow named Cormac Russell called Rekindling Democracy. I'd encourage you to give it a read. If you haven't already engaged with something on the asset-based community development approach to things, this could be an okay introduction for you. But one of the things that Cormac, one of the things he asks is, are you a citizen or do you just live here? And this is really about asking people the question, are you expecting the institutions that our society has created to do things for you or to you? Or are you an engaged person in the community? Are you an engaged neighborhood that has recognized what strengths the people around you have and what can happen if you bring those together? So he talks a lot about the model of, doing things to people, which is what institutions sometimes do. There's very little actual engagement there. Doing things for people, which is perhaps service, but you're still maybe not asking the people that you're doing things for whether what you're doing is helpful or actually what they most need. So we're trying to move beyond that, more towards the ideas of doing things with people and people doing things for themselves, things being done by the community. Those are much better models. And this is where it's important to have expert people engaged on the issues that you're trying to serve. The photo in the lower left is one of the things that Greenwood has been doing in our communities, called Community 101. And lately what we've been doing is just bringing people together into a place, and we've been telling them that, you've got some strengths and you don't have to rely on government and institutions to do everything. That, if you connect with one another, there's a lot of things that a community can do all by itself, and then decide where it needs to reach up and out for support. And so this is a photo from one of our gatherings where we're not sure what's going to happen on an evening, but somebody's going to have an idea. Might be 5 or 6 different ideas, and those ideas are shared. And then people can engage and begin to work around the tables in that evening on making progress on issues. And this is a place where the Sleeping Cabin Initiative has been initiated. And many other good ideas have come out of this forum as well. So I think this just demonstrates the power of bringing people together in community and what you can do. So I'm going to ask a few more rhetorical questions, and I'd really encourage you to take these away and think about them. Write them down and really think about what your response to these would be. And these are questions that we ask the community when we get people to glob around a Greenwood event. What do you care about so much that you're willing to act on it? What do you care about that you're willing to act on? And then think about, what are your personal talents? What are your skills? What's motivating you? What do you have to contribute? Maybe what you have to contribute is support. Maybe what you have to contribute is a network. Maybe you know somebody who should meet somebody so that together they can do something really great. How do you make those connections? How can you find a way to make them happen? That's one of the things that Greenwood tries to encourage the community to do, so that we can extend our own individual efforts. So lastly, before we get to Q&A, I think I'm bang on time. That's unusual. I was listening to the opening address this morning from Bishop Priscilla, and she shared this reflection that the purpose of decolonization is the rehumanization of us all. The rehumanization of us all. And what that spoke to me was, if we think about specifically the issues of housing and homelessness, that right relationship on that issue is about humanity and home. Yes, the buildings are part of it, and an important part, but it's also just as important to remember that those people in our community are not homeless, they're human.
Thank you so much, Shane. That was a really wonderful account of projects that you're involved in, but also underlying philosophy and motivations that I think all of us can take and try to put to work in our own contexts. And thank you as well for graciously agreeing to entertain questions. People can use the raise hand function so that we can maintain a kind of order of speakers, or feel free to put questions and comments in the chat as well.
Yeah, I can see the chat here, so I'll just respond to a couple questions I've seen pop up there. So someone's asked, Dave has asked, are tiny cabins electrically heated? So yes, the tiny cabins are insulated, they're heated. There's different approaches to the heat, but all the ones that we've observed are electric. So that's either an electric baseboard or wall unit, sort of permanently affixed in the unit, or it's a portable space heater. They're not very big. 80 square feet doesn't take a whole lot to heat. And somebody wants me to put the 3 questions slide back up, so I'm happy to do that for a minute. Actually, what I'll do is I'll put those 3 questions in the chat. So if you want to.
That's perfect. Thank you. Just backtracking a little, Joanne had a comment earlier about invisibility of homelessness in certain communities, and observing that, of course, people tend to cluster where there are support services. And of course, that has the effect of displacing people from their original communities, which can be either exciting if you're that sort of a person, or traumatic if there were elements of your home support networks that are then cut off from.
Yeah, I think there's various positions on that issue. I've spoken with groups. You know, we've been knocking on doors looking for a courageous property owner who would be willing to sort of be the first in our community to host sleeping cabins. And you know, some of the issues that come up sometimes are, well, what if this becomes a magnet for more than just the 10 cabins that you'd like to put on this property? And, you know, in one respect, you want to be able to say, well, that would be great if we could engage more intentionally with those other people, because those people are in the community, whether they're seen or not, they're there. And if there's something happening that draws them to it because it seems to be something hopeful, then I'm not sure that's a bad thing. But recognizing you know, the realities and practicalities on the ground, there certainly does need to be some control and consideration for the safety of the community who lives in a tiny cabin or sleeping cabin neighborhood, and that community is interested in its own safety and security as well. And so when we ask people, you know, we're consulting with people who have lived with homelessness, who are experiencing homelessness now on those issues. You know, what's going to make this work for you? You know, what should we be thinking about when we're designing this? You know, we're involving those people in our committee meetings. So that can be a tricky and complex issue, and one that communities can, you know, just depends on how courageous you are, I'd say. Somebody's asked in the chat here, how much does a sleeping cabin cost, just the building? So I've seen prices range from around $6,000 or $7,000 to the ones that Kingston ended up using, I think were closer to $15,000. They had some fancier features in them. So they had indicator lights, for example, to let somebody outside know whether or not a smoke detector inside the cabin was functional or not. So there's also different models that could be considered for building them, whether that's a community build, sort of like a habitat style build, or whether that's a professional organization who's building them. The ones in Kitchener, the original ones, were built by the Mennonite community there, I believe.
Hi, Shane, it's Peter. Sorry, I'm just using my phone, so I don't see the little putting up your hand opportunities. So would it be okay if I asked a question?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah. So with all of these things, certainly in the urban sense, but I think everywhere, there are a number, and I'm sure you're aware of them, and because a lot of the agencies are dealing with it in downtown Toronto anyway, there is municipal and money in Toronto that's available, but there's also federal money that would apply, for example, in the regions outside of Toronto where municipalities may not be, you know, they don't have a housing secretariat and all the types of things that Toronto does. But there's the Federation of Canadian Municipalities and CMHC, which I'm sure you know about their programs, but they've actually got a fair bit of money. There's an awful lot of paperwork and a lot of delay. So that's something that, in terms of actually trying to get something going so that you've got traction and you're responding to people's actual needs, well, you know, you get started, and the truth is you're probably not going to be serving the people that you're staring in the face of, because it won't happen for 3 or 4 or 5 years. And so that's, you know, it's much less immediate, but there's that sort of approach as well, which is one that I think right now, and maybe it'll change with if there's a different government federally or something like that. But right now, there actually is money, and so I don't know how that sort of in situation would apply to the ones that we're talking about, because it's there.
Yeah, for certain, there's money out there, and I think with the sort of thing we're talking about with sleeping cabins as sort of the sort of community-driven crisis response to issues of homelessness. I know there's money in the community, certainly the generosity that I've seen in Port Hope and Cobourg and in Northumberland County more broadly is not going to be an issue. Government absolutely has got a role to play. And one of the things that makes things even a little bit more complicated in our community is that we've got a two-tier kind of municipal level government. So we've got individual municipalities like Port Hope and Cobourg who are wanting to do things about the issue of homelessness in their respective towns. But also we've got a county level government, which so county council is basically all of the mayors from the municipalities in the county. They form county council, and the county actually has the biggest or the most levers, let's say, to pull on the issue of housing. So they administer a number of programs for affordable housing. They support the shelter, which the only real shelter we have is in Cobourg. And so absolutely government needs to be engaged. But I think one of the takeaways from today might be that there's a lot that the community can do, and it's important for the community to speak. It's important for the community to engage with government, and oftentimes the community can find the efficient ways to get things done that are the win-win. Not every time, but there's lots of things that a community-driven initiative can get kicked off in a way that institutions struggle to, as you say, it takes a long time.
I just wanted to observe, Shane, that if, for people who are in a church context where they may not feel they have the resources to embark on a project like this, it's still really crucial to get in the fight against NIMBYism. I mean, we've seen that in my parish context in Willowdale in Toronto, where the city was ready to build modular housing, a modest structure for people who were going to be supported. There was going to be 24-hour live-in support, and people were going to be carefully chosen to make the most of the situation. And the city was full speed ahead. And there it was NIMBYism that united with a different level of government and brought it to a halt. But speaking up in favor of initiatives that are already underway is also something really crucial, and something that you can do if your own resources don't extend to getting involved in an actual building project.
Yeah, the new acronym is what we want is PIMBY, please, in my backyard.
Well, that's better than YIMBY. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think you raise a good point. I think that example, I'm not sure the details, but I can see how it might have been the case in the example that you're pointing out, where somebody decided that something's going to happen to a neighborhood, and that's more in the sort of institutions doing things to people. It's important not only to engage with the people who you're intending to serve, or you're intending to work with, but the whole neighborhood. And I believe that if you take the approach of starting with the neighborhood, starting, you know, uh, you might look at the neighborhood as the smallest unit of democracy, right, beyond the individual. That if you start there, then the neighborhood can engage. The neighborhood can decide to say please, as opposed to feeling like things are being done to them.
Louise has her hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to just say that in addition to all of this, it's really, really important. What I've seen here in Wasaga Beach is people who are living in really substandard conditions, like motel rooms. So they have a hot plate and a fridge, and they're paying $1,300 to $1,500 a month in rent. But it's because they can't raise first and last month's rent, because they don't have a credit record. No landlord is going to rent to them. They can't get into, and there is housing, modest housing here, that they could rent that would be cheaper, but they can't get through to become a tenant. And I know from my experience renting here, I pretty well had to give my firstborn to be considered as a tenant, like for personal references, bank checks, reference checks, employer letters, for quite a modest little place. And they just can't get past that barrier. So I don't know if, I just struggle with how we might be able to help people get over some of those hurdles and help themselves.
Yeah, I don't have an answer, but it sounds like a really good question to ask in the community, right? Who are those people who are interested in engaging on that sort of question?
Yeah.
Who are the people who are facing that struggle, and have a conversation together? But what could be done to try and knock that roadblock down? And probably include some landlords in that conversation too. Like, not everybody's going to want to engage in that conversation, but that's the sort of thing where I think if you find a way to bring some people together, that it's sometimes you can't imagine what's going to happen, and maybe something good can come at it, and maybe it requires a bit of persistence too. But still, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I'm going back far more years than I care to remember, but when I was a banker, I remember once financing some gentleman that bought a fourplex. That is, a big house that had 4 units in it, and 3 of their tenants turned out to be gems, but one was an absolute disaster, and he ruined the whole investment for them. And I think this is a concern that owners have, is all of these blocks that the lady mentioned before me are expressions of reality for people who are renting, because they are taking a risk sometimes. And so in my mind, we've got to find some way of balancing these issues out. And I don't know what the answer is, but
Yeah, it's a very valid comment, Stu. It reminds me of an initiative that one city in Peterborough is taking on, where I think what they're doing is they're sort of being an intermediary between landlords and tenants in the group that they're serving, so that you maybe have an empathetic landlord, um, but if you can help the landlord out by providing an intermediary group that's sort of taking responsibility for the tenants and helping to uh, make sure that tenants are forming community and that they're being supported and that things are going as well as they could, then that's sort of one approach that I've seen begin to emerge in that place, that is maybe sort of one possible answer to concerns that landlords could have. But very valid point that you made.
It's
Needs-
Peter. Again, it is this thing, and you're right that it's a tricky thing finding a balance, and especially with respect to landlords who are good people for sure, but they are running a business, and they do have their particular focus, and so that when you talk about a balance, I guess one of the things that comes up is, well, inherently there really isn't a balance, because the people who are struggling to have homes don't have anywhere near as much of a voice as the landlords and the property owners, and so that sometimes it is a political issue, and one that in situations where you get like the one that was described about where the city wanted to decided that they could go ahead with the modular units, and then another level of government, presumably for certain the province, must be the province,
Oh,
I
yeah.
would say. Just with their sort of political leanings, actually interfered. And of course, recent jurisprudence has shown that over the voting issue members of council issue has shown that in fact the courts, the laws now are now to be interpreted that the city is entirely the creature of the province. But nevertheless, it is an issue like that is a political issue, I think, where people do need to mobilize, because in Toronto, the city, and I don't know with the brand new council we have, but I think I'm still optimistic. The city's been pretty good about, it's not just at a political level, but it's a sort of a political will that exists at the political level, but it's worked its way down into the actual civil service. And so that the people who are the housing representatives for the housing secretariat and for housing, shelter, and support are really dedicated to trying to help and trying to move the needle. If you can get that happening in municipalities and get a political will going, I think that actually compensates for some of the balance that you need to give voices to people who otherwise can't be heard with respect to their needs.
Thank you, Peter. And we are now 7 minutes over our prescribed endpoint, and I notice a few people have had to drop off. So I think we should probably bring this to a close, but all the sessions, as you know, have been recorded and will be made available by Social Justice and Advocacy in about a week's time. Shane, thank you again so much for your presentation and for all the possibilities that you've opened up for people. And thank you to everyone who's participated, because we've had a very lively discussion about issues and options. I would, at this point, simply say, let us go in peace to rejoin at the closing plenary in 7 minutes. Thank you all very much.